where are you located?
I live in the Hudson Valley in New York. So if you know where Woodstock and Kingston are, I live about 100 miles north of New York City, right on the
Okay, yeah, but you had family in Arkansas growing up, so that's kinda
right.
where
Yeah.
that correlation came in from.
Right. Yeah. Well, my whole family, many generations back, is from Arkansas. And my parents met when they were students at the University of Arkansas in the '70s, and then I grew up in Colorado because my family moved around a few times and eventually wound up in Colorado, which is where I grew up. But the whole rest of the family was and is still in Arkansas, and so when I was growing up, we would visit Arkansas usually every Christmas and sometimes in the summers too. So I've spent a lot of time there, although I'm not from there.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, that's very cool, man. So I'll just kinda give the backstory, Benjamin, of how I even came across your book. So I obviously, being from there, I follow, a newsletter, Axios, Northwest Arkansas, and they had posted a story about your book in the newsletter, and I was like, "Holy cow, I've never heard of this
Yeah.
case before. I don't even know this story." And they had your book spotlighted, and I was like, "Man, I gotta reach out to Benjamin, see if I can get him on the Books for Guys podcast and talk
Yeah.
about this, 'cause just for me personally, I'm personally interested, and a lot of people in Arkansas that I'm friends with and just friends in general, I was like, they're gonna love this story, because I don't know if they know about it." But
Yeah.
as I was digging in, I didn't realize, so your book's called Cave Mountain,
Hmm.
and I didn't realize, though, that the ties you had, it was your cousin who went through this experience, and then you got the story all put together. But man, just
Right.
dive in a little bit, because I don't wanna say too much. I'd love for you to just share what the story is all about, without giving away too much. I want people to read your book, but tell the
Hmm.
story and just how it came about, and then how you got it put together in this book.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the it starts out with this thing that happened to my family about 25 years ago. This happened in April of 2001, where my cousin, Haley Zaga, when she was 6 years old, she was on a hike with her grandparents, who were my aunt and uncle, and they were on a hike along with a few friends of theirs from the Sierra Club. There were about 6 people there, and Haley got lost on the hike, and she was gone for 3 days, and she was eventually found. And the story of how she got rescued is kind of crazy in its own right, but she was rescued, and then shortly after she was found, a few days later, when her parents took her home, and it was like a crowd of reporters camped out on the lawn outside their house in Fayetteville, and they just didn't like what this kind of psychological whiplash might be doing to their daughter, so they decided to just take her away for a few days, and they went on an impromptu family vacation up to St. Louis to see the Gateway Arch, and when they were on the way up there, Haley told her parents about the imaginary friend that she'd had when she was lost in the woods. And she was very specific. She said that her imaginary friend was 4 years old, had long dark hair. She had pigtails and had a red shirt and purple pants on and white sneakers. And she had a flashlight with her, and her name was Alicia. And she said that she had this imaginary friend from the moment that she realized she was lost until the moment that she was rescued. And she told the story and made her parents kind of hairs stand on end. And then that story kind of made the rounds amongst all the adults who'd been involved in the search and rescue operation, including this guy, Tim Ernst, who is a nature photographer and a kind of, local sort of celebrity in, Arkansas, who happened to live right near the place where Haley got lost, which is he used to have a house right on Hawksbill Crag Trail in Newton County, where this happened, on Cave Mountain. And when she was lost, Tim opened up his house to her parents and grandparents and their friends who were helping with the search. And after it was over, Tim Ernst was a friend of the family. And a few months after this happened, Tim sent my Aunt Joyce, who's Haley's grandmother, who was the last person to see her before she got lost, who was more, racked with, not only during this whole ordeal, not only was she terrified for her granddaughter, but she was also just racked with guilt over the feeling that it had been her fault that her granddaughter had gotten lost. And during those 3 days, she was increasingly concerned, possibly killed. And Tim sent her an email saying, "My wife, Pam, the other night we were talking about Haley's Alicia, and Pam asked me if there had ever been any little girls who died or got lost in those woods." And then I realized, yes, actually there was this one case that happened in the 70s where there was a cult that murdered a little girl and buried her in a bucket on on the side of Cave Mountain, maybe about a mile and a half away as the crow flies from where Haley got lost. And for some reason, they were taken to jail in Benton County, even though it happened over here. And that's all he knew or remembered. And then Joyce kind of went into detective mode and went to the Benton County Sheriff's Office and asked them if they had any records of this case. And they didn't, but there was someone there at the Sheriff's Office who remembered that Judge Tom Keith had been involved in that case somehow. And Judge Tom Keith, he was a judge in Bentonville, and Jay and Joyce were friends with him. They were about the same age, and they knew him. So Joyce called up Tom Keith and asked if he had been involved in this case, and he said, "Yes, I was." The local newspapers for the last week of April 1978, and then come back to me. And she did. She filled herself in on what happened, and basically there was a very small cult that apparently the leader of this cult was a 17-year-old boy that they believed was a prophet, and they had been in Baton Rouge for a while before they had moved to the Northwest Arkansas area, and pardon me, and they had gone to the middle of nowhere out in Newton County, out kind of near Jasper, maybe about 45 minutes away from Jasper. And they were camped out there because they believed that there was about to be a nuclear war that would wipe out human civilization, followed by the 3.5 year period of apocalyptic chaos prophesied in the book of Revelation, followed by the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. And they had killed this little girl for some reason, and there were 5 people who were arrested. Four of them were convicted of the murder, and of the 4 that were convicted of the murder, Tom Keith, it turns out, before he was a judge, he had been a lawyer. He was a criminal defense lawyer, and he'd been assigned to the public defense of the only defendant whose case went to trial, which was Lucy Clark, is what I call her in the book. That's a pseudonym. And she was the mother of the girl who was killed, and she was a member of the cult, and she was only 22 years old at the time this happened. And the other 3 people who were convicted of the murder, who was the 17-year-old prophet, his father, and his older half brother, those 3 guys were all given very long prison sentences, and Lucy was only given 5 years, and she only served half of that. And so she got out of prison at 25, and she still had her life in front of her. And Tom had kept up with her. Tom had an almost kind of like mentor sort of relationship with her, a kind of an avuncular relationship. He really liked her, and he thought it was an absolute miscarriage of justice that she'd ever been convicted of the murder. He thought that she was just as much a victim of the cult as her daughter had been, and that she never should have been convicted and never should have served prison time. And he was still mad about it, 23 years later. But he'd kept in touch with her that whole time. And in Lucy's life, she lives near Baton Rouge, where she's from, and she got married to somebody else, had another family, had a career, had a whole life after that. And very few people in her daily social orbit know anything about what happened in her past. Her husband knows, and a couple of people very close to her know, but most people don't. And Tom Keith knew. Tom Keith was one of the only people who wasn't her husband who knew about everything that happened, that she kept regular touch with. And Tom said to Joyce, "Would you like me to introduce her to you?" And she said, "Yes." And so Tom connected them. And my Aunt Joyce and Lucy uh, started emailing each other and talking on the phone, and kind of they became friends. And they became friends kind of through this belief that that her daughter, who was murdered in 1978, was the spirit or something that guided Haley to safety when she was lost in 2001. And in Lucy's case, Joyce was racked with guilt, but the guilt that she felt was nowhere near the level of guilt that Lucy had to live with over the years. She said that believing this was the only thing that had kind of helped to close the psychological wound for her in all that time. And she wrote in an email that she started to believe that maybe her daughter hadn't had a completely wasted life after all, and that perhaps Bethany had to die in order to save Haley, and Haley had to live in order to save me in some way. And so that's the story in a not exactly a nutshell, more of a coconut shell.
Yeah. No, but that's just I mean, Benjamin, how if you don't mind me asking, how old were you during the time when Haley went missing?
I was 17. I was about a month away from graduating high school when this happened.
Mhm. And so when like, what was your experience, I guess, of knowing what was going on then? And then because I'm sitting here thinking, like, if you didn't go down the path you took of becoming a writer and putting stories together, like, this
Yeah.
may not be a book like it is now that you've put out there, and specifically, it's even more incredible because it's your family that's involved, but I'm just thinking, like, what was it like for you then? And then what was the process of all these conversations? Because the 4 people that were convicted, are they all still alive? Are they still incarcerated or
No, pardon me. I mean, and really, that was, one of the most incredible things that happened to me. So I wrote this as it was an article in Harper's magazine that came out in the summer of 2023, and this book is kind of the expanded version of it. But it's a bit different from the article because there's some things that I know now that I didn't know when I wrote that article,
Yeah.
and some people that I met after writing it. And one of those people, so okay, there were 5 people convicted of 5 people arrested, 4 people convicted because one of them was given a plea deal for in exchange for she was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying as a witness. So that person got off, and then the other 4 arrested were Lucy, who served 2.5 years, and then the teenage prophet and his father. They were both given life sentences. His father, Royal Harris, was in his 50s then, and he died in prison back in the 90s. And then his older half brother, who was also a member of the cult, he was 31 when he was arrested, and he took a plea deal that the prosecutor offered and pled guilty in exchange for 2 sentences, one of 50 years and one of 15 years for possession for another a related crime. So he was effectively given 65 years. And he's ultimately served about 15 years of his sentence before he was released on parole, and then ultimately paroled out of the system a few years later. And then the teenage prophet, Mark Harris, he was also he like his father pled no contest, and also like his father was given a life sentence. But and he served 40 years in prison before in 2012 there was the Supreme Court ruled that you can't give someone a life sentence without possibility of parole for a crime that was committed when that person was a minor. And there were some people who were able to get part of their sentences retroactively paroled because that law now applied to them, and Mark was one of them. And so he was released on parole in 2018, and he is the last. He and Lucy are the only ones left of the 5 who were initially arrested who are still alive. All the other people people who died. I mean, Royal died a long time ago, but two of the other people that I would have, I wish that I had started writing this book like 5 years earlier, because if I had, there were several key people who were still alive that I could have talked to that I didn't get a chance to because they died right before I started working on this book. Winston Fenn Harris died about 6 years ago, and so did Suzette Kleinpeter, who were the other people arrested. But Mark Harris, the guy who was the 17-year-old prophet, who was supposedly the leader of the cult back in 1978, and had apparently been the one to make the decision to murder the child, he was released about 9 years ago, and he's still alive. He's in his early 60s, and meeting him was probably the most incredible thing that I did as research for this book.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's what I'm really curious about is what was that like? Because I know obviously what he did and was a part of is just it's horrific. You just I don't know the words to explain it, terrible. And it doesn't, it didn't have a direct impact on what your cousin, there wasn't anything bad, thankfully, that happened to your cousin, but just
Right.
the story of her and the imaginary friend. But what was it like talking with, and you said his name's Mark.
Huh.
What was
Yeah.
it like sitting down and talking with him and just kind of what was that experience like?
It was an incredible experience. It was definitely the most affecting and, moving experience that I had writing the book. Mark Harris was difficult to track down because one, his name is Mark Harris, which is almost like John Smith, and two, he didn't want to be found. But I was eventually able to locate him, and I contacted him via, email, and I called him on the phone. And at first he was extremely resistant to help with the project, but I kind of, said that I'm not interested in villainizing him or anything like that. I just want to get at the truth of what happened. And ultimately he warmed to me, and I talked with him on the phone a few times and had, very long conversations with him. And then a few months later, I had time to go down and visit him in person. I had to physically go there because he can't travel because he's still on parole. He was paroled out of state to, I say Georgia in the book. That's also uh, it's a southern state.
Yeah.
Georgia was a stand-in, but he can't leave this state, and he'll probably not be able to for the rest of his life. I went down there and interviewed him in person, and spent a long day with him and his wife, and honestly, the experience was, of all the people that I wound up needing to talk to for this book, Mark was the one who I found to be most on my own kind of philosophical wavelength. He's a really smart guy and really well read, and he said that as soon as he was separated from his father and brother when he first went to prison in 1978, he said that there was a sudden mental clarity that he had that he'd never had before. That he grew up in a cult, and basically his mother was really the real founder and leader of this cult, and she told everyone that she was a prophet, and then she told the whole cult that her son Mark Harris also had the power of prophecy. She said this when he was 12 years old, and then a couple of years later, when he was 15, she died of a heart attack, and kind of left this 15-year-old boy at this center of this power vacuum in the middle of this cult. But he said as soon as he went to prison, he had a new kind of newfound mental clarity for the first time in his life, and he started reading, and he read a lot, and he was, he's basically an autodidact. He's a very well educated person, and really a really smart and interesting person, and a really fascinating person to have a conversation with.
Yeah.
And I the way that I used to tell this story before I wrote the book is that I would end on the note of Joyce and Lucy becoming unlikely friends. But now when I tell the story, I say, as a result of my having written this book, Mark Harris and I have kind of
Yeah.
become friends,
Yeah.
right? We still email each other, fairly often. And he's just like, some of the conversations that I had with him about, he really changed the direction that the book took in a few important ways, in that, like, that Mark is extremely knowledgeable about the history of of Protestant theology, and had very smart and interesting opinions about the ways that Protestant theology kind of developed into fundamentalism in the 20th century, and it's like those are some of my favorite parts of the book. I know it's not for everyone. Sometimes I look at the Goodreads reviews and people say like it's supposed to be true crime, but then he like goes off for 5 pages about Martin Luther. It's
Well,
like,
it's
sorry, those
interesting.
are my favorite parts.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me. I mean, my wife and I are watching this big documentary on Netflix right now about the FLDS, cult out in Utah, Arizona, and it's like we're just fascinated by how these things even come about and just the way. But you hit on a good point. I mean, Mark's a young kid and he doesn't know any better. Again, no excuse for all the things that went on, but like they get brought up into this lifestyle. So yeah, and again, kids don't know any better. They're easily influenced, and so you can kind of. I'm sure you dug into this, and as he educated himself, he, like you said, mental clarity. Like, wow, that was not probably the right thing to do, or again, it's just fascinating that his transformation and just the thoughts behind that. I can see why for you that's such an intriguing part of the story of just his progression over life and just from that moment till now and just everything he's gone through and
Yeah.
there's yeah, he's someone that I would love to get inside his head and to think about you got to do that, which again, you talk about just how incredible that was.
Yeah.
Was anyone able to verify, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the young girl's name that was murdered. Was anyone able to verify what she was wearing based off what Haley had said she saw her wearing?
I don't think so. I also gave her a pseudonym in the book. In the book, she's called Bethany Alana Clark, not her real name, but it's similar. And no, I mean, she was wearing white sneakers. I didn't, I believe I did ask that at some point. I don't think, um, I have pictures taken from the crime scene. I've got pictures of her. They're in black and white.
Yeah.
So, the
Yeah.
white
No, it's
sneakers,
just
I can.
interesting that Haley was so specific, and if Lucy or Mark remembered that, just again, it seems to be very verifiable, but to think like, wow, like that was her,
Yeah,
it again, it probably is. It's just crazy how again, how detailed Haley was in describing the imaginary friend, and then just be able to go back and be like, "Wow, that's if there's one person that could have been,
yeah.
it's her."
Well, I mean, I think, like, there are so many coincidences or near coincidences that kind of help to, create this ghost story, There was the fact that these 2 incidents happened, not exactly in the same place, but about a mile and a half away from each other.
Yeah.
Um, I believe that, Bethany Alana Clark was murdered on, pardon me, April 25th, 1978, and Haley got lost on April 29th, 2001. So, not the exact same day, but within 5 days of the same time of year on the calendar. And the fact that, Haley said her imaginary friend was 4, Bethany was 3, or like 3.5 or so. And then there are also kind of like, when I read through the emails that Joyce and Lucy exchanged after they connected, part of me kind of thinks that I see people kind of like finding new breadcrumbs in a trail that they've already decided is there, and that like Haley said that Alicia had a flashlight with her, which would have been extremely useful in those dark woods at night if she had actually had one. But she said she had a flashlight with her. And, and Lucy said there was this one time when Suzette took away Bethany's doll. I think she said she had a Raggedy Ann doll and took away the doll and threw it in a fire or something because it was like pagan idolatry or whatever. That Lucy, best thing toy that she could replace the doll with was she gave Bethany a flashlight, and she slept with this flashlight like it was a stuffed animal. And that, it turns out that a flashlight was one of Bethany's only possessions. All of these things are kind of like, I don't. I definitely don't suggest that there was a ghost in the book myself because that's not my job. I'm less interested in the ghost than in the fact that people believe in it.
Yeah. Well, and just again, people hear this all the time too, like kids, they're just more open than adults are and just the experiences, and this one, there's just a lot of correlation and just a lot of uniqueness to it, which makes the story so fascinating.
Thank you.
What does I'm sure you don't have to speak for her, but just from your experience of Haley reading your book and kind of revisiting and these conversations, what's that been like? I guess what does that look like to you that she's been able to experience through all this?
I think it's mostly been a positive experience for her. I mean, I did a reading in Fayetteville about a month ago, and she, after I did the reading, I just said, please everyone welcome, Haley Zaga, and she came up
Here's
on
the
stage
star.
with me. And yeah, and she did, and we both did a, kind of a Q&A session with the audience, and it was a lot of fun. It was really trippy. I mean, it was in Fayetteville, so like, our whole family showed up, and so did lots of people who are involved in the story. Like Tim Ernst was there, and a lot of the people who helped with the search and rescue operation were there, and it was just kind of like it was an odd event. It was really kind of like rewarding, and it felt great to do this reading with all of these people who were there, including Haley. And so yeah, I mean, Haley is. I say that she's my cousin. She's actually my first cousin once removed because Haley's mother is my actual first cousin. It's just that because Haley's father, my dad's older brother, was 20 years older than him. The age gap makes it so that it feels more like Haley and I are kind of more of the same generation than, I think of her mother as more like my dad's generation than because of her age. So Haley's 11 years younger than I am, and she's naturally just kind of one of my best friends in my among my extended family in Arkansas anyway. She's also a really smart, interesting person. We've always had this kind of like, I feel like we've had always had a bit of a connection in that, like, whenever we happen to see each other at, family gatherings, it's like, we love a lot of the same books and movies and music. And like, I think that if we had met some other way and didn't happen to be related, and we would have become friends anyway. So
Yeah.
it's always been very easy to talk with her, I mean, like, and even when I was writing the book, there would be things like I was trying to file a records request with the county sheriff's office, and I was emailing with some people, and I wasn't in Arkansas at this point. I was trying to do this, from my home here in upstate New York, and I was on the phone with somebody at the Benton County Sheriff, and when they realized that I wasn't an Arkansas resident, they said, "Oh, you have to be an Arkansas resident to apply for this request and fill out this piece of paper." And so I was like, all right. And so I called up Haley and said, "Hey, this is a big favor. It is sometime on a day when you don't happen to have anything to do. Would you mind going up to the Benton County Sheriff and filling out this paperwork for this records request because you're an Arkansas resident?" And she did. Like, so she actually helped me as like almost like a research assistant, like once or twice in this book.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was gonna ask just because, again, Benjamin, this is unique because it's your family and there's a lot of that involved, but has this and you've written other books, like I mentioned, to start this podcast. Now that you've written this, I guess a two-part question, has this been the most challenging and most rewarding work that you've put out there? And now that you've written this story, what's your future work going to look like in your opinion? Because what you've written has been different
Yeah.
in your style of books. And so I'm just curious, like, what your future projects may look like and what do you think that's going to be?
I don't know yet because have been kind of poking around at the edges of a few projects that I'm thinking about starting. And one of them is another nonfiction book that would be kind of a spiritual sequel to this book, which is that, like, uh, about the rewardingness, my two other books are fiction. It's a novel. My first book was a novel, and my second book was a collection of short stories. And like when you're writing fiction, it's a very lonely process. Doing the research is often just like reading a ton of books about the subjects that you're thinking about writing about. And then the work it involves a lot of like pacing around alone in, the room that you write in, trying to like put together this fictional universe in the book. And it's like when you write fiction, it's, almost most fiction writers kind of get into this mode where they're like a crazy person with a conspiracy theory in a movie with like, stuff tacked to the wall and strings linking all the things, like that's kind of what it feels like to write a novel. Whereas writing nonfiction is a lot more fun in a way because it's like much of it just involves getting out into the world and talking to people, and like the process of tracking people down and then introducing myself to them, trying to win their trust so that they'll talk to me, and then talking with the person. That's always so much fun. I love doing it. And like a funny anecdote I tell about doing research for this book is that like what part of Arkansas do you live in?
So I'm in Tennessee now, but I'm from
Okay.
Springdale, Fayetteville area is where I grew
Okay,
up.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I had to do a lot of research in Jasper, which is this tiny little town in the middle of Newton County, way out in the middle of the Ozarks. And at some point, I had gone to the Newton County Sheriff's Office in Jasper, and I asked if they had records of this case from 1978, and I was in. The back room of the sheriff's office looking through all these handwritten police records from the 70s. And, there was nothing in there about this case. And the guy that I was talking to said, well, a guy who used to be sheriff here, Ray Watkins, he was the sheriff for a while in the 70s and 80s. And he works at the hardware store now. So if you go there and they're about to close, you go over there now, you might still catch him. And he might know something about this. And I was like, all right. So I, hightailed it over to Do It Best Hardware and Lumber, right outside of Jasper, Arkansas. And I went in there and found an almost 90-year-old man sitting at the counter in front of the cash register. And I asked him, "Are you Ray Watkins, former sheriff of Newton County?" And he was like, "Yes, sir." And I said, "Okay. Do you know anything about this crazy thing that happened in 1978 where there were some cult members who murdered a 3-year-old girl and buried her in a bucket on Cave Mountain?" And he said, "Yeah, I was the one who arrested him." And then what proceeded was one of the most incredible interviews that I recorded for the book. It was kind of the first interview that I recorded with him. There are these silences that happen on the tape periodically because those were the times that the interview it had to be interrupted because somebody needed to buy something at the hardware store and he had to ring them up. And it was just like oftentimes I would find people that I needed to talk to just by driving around in Newton County in the general area that I knew a certain person lived, and just popping into a gas station and asking someone, the person behind the counter, "Do you know this person?" And often they would say, "Oh yeah, you got to," they would like give me directions to the person's house, and I would knock on the door, and that's how I found a few people here in
Yeah.
when I was doing research. So
Yeah.
yeah, just I love writing fiction, but the process of writing nonfiction is just so much more fun that, I'm not sure what I'm gonna do next. But the project that I'm kind of poking around at, thinking about starting would be kind of a sequel to this book in that it would have to do with, the fact that there was a lot of illegal pot farming that happened in the Ozarks in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and probably still, but I think it's, less profitable now because it's legal in half the country. But there was a lot of local police corruption having to do with all this pot farming because often in these tiny rural counties with very low populations, like in Newton County, sometimes the only cop in the whole county is the sheriff himself, and it's an elected position. And if there's only one person in the sheriff's department, it's just a ripe situation for corruption because you only have to pay off one person. So there was a lot of kind of like mafia style, collusion between organized crime and law enforcement that happened in the Ozarks in the 70s and 80s. And it's just kind of it's a cool story. And so that's what I'm thinking about writing next.
Yeah.
But
Well,
listen,
that sounds absolutely fascinating. I think you definitely should write that, and then we
yeah,
should definitely have another conversation when you publish that because
I hope so. Yeah.
that's another topic and story that I don't know a lot about, but I know a lot of people would find very interesting
Yeah.
to learn more about. And yeah, I'm glad you answered my last question because I was that's what I was thinking. I was like, okay, so fiction and nonfiction, and just wondering if like you got the itch to go hunt and have those conversations and put the pieces together and have the and it sounds like that was such a rush and a joy for you to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Sounds like that's probably leading into the next project, which is really cool.
Yeah, I hope so. I don't know yet because I have a lot of things kind of like projects that are just, in their very early stages that I might pursue pretty soon. But the one about the, pot farming and police corruption in the Ozarks in the 70s and 80s is the one that I'm hoping to pursue. It's another kind of project that like I better hurry up and start doing the research for it because a lot of the people that I want to talk to are dead or you know, dying. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Well, Benjamin, this is man, thank you again for doing this
Absolutely.
because and I'm so glad I followed that newsletter and saw that story pop up. And I'm so glad I reached out to you because you're gonna laugh. Like I was reading it early in the morning. My wife comes downstairs before coffee, and I was like, "You're not gonna believe this! Like, this story is insane. I've got to talk to this guy. This is just." And she was like, "That is wild." And I was like, "I'm emailing Benjamin right now. I gotta talk to him." And
Fantastic.
so
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for asking me.
yeah, absolutely, man. And thank you for sharing. We've got your book on the Books for Guys website. And so proud to spotlight it and hope lots of people read it. It sounds like you've been very busy with the book coming out recently with conversations and all of that. And can't wait to see what else you work on, as we will certainly love to have you back on and talk more about your future work. But no, Benjamin, this has been great. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And, please keep in touch. It'll probably be at least a few years before I publish another book, but I'm always ready, willing, and able to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, appreciate it, Benjamin.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.